Welcome to Byte Size, a series where we talk to traffic and mobility experts, discuss innovation, and highlight business leaders within transport and city planning. Hello everybody, my name is Emily Bobbis. Welcome back to our first episode of the Byte Size podcast for 2021. Today I'm going to be talking to Yale Z Wong, PhD and Principal from Dr. Transportation, which provides international transport advisory services. Yale is an international advisor and social entrepreneur in the public transport and intelligent transport systems sectors. He holds a PhD from the University of Sydney, where his doctoral dissertation focused on mobility as a service, also known as MAS for short, and its implications on incumbent transport operators and emerging business models. Yale helped to establish Mobility Champions as a social enterprise to help accelerate low-carbon mobility. He also holds positions as ANZ's Market Lead at the Cities Forum, and is an Honorary Associate at the Institute of Transport and Logistics Studies from the University of Sydney. Yale is a thought leader, a strategic advisor, and a powerful industry advocate, having won the David Willis Prize in 2018, the ITLS Research Prize also in 2018, and in 2019, Yale was selected by ITS Australia as the Youth Ambassador to the World Congress, and was also the recipient of a Young Professional Award. Today, I'll be picking Yale's brain about all things public transport, particularly relation to fragmented systems or operations and management, and this idea of a 15-minute city, how we get to and from, and what that means to us as customers. So, Yale, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Great to be with you, Emily.
I ask most people that come on the podcast about this. So what sparked your initial interest in transportation, or how did you come to be in your current role?
Well, in my current role, I run a boutique transport advisory and I serve an international clientele, helping in growing businesses across public transport, micromobility, startups advisory, and also associations as well. In terms of interest, transportation has been very much part and parcel of my upbringing. I moved around a lot growing up. I went to 6 different primary schools. I moved between cities and countries as well. And what I could really appreciate moving around is how, I guess, firstly, how different cities do their urban design and do their transportation, and also, I guess, personal experiences in different cities as well, and including in different parts of cities too, and just how much of an impact and difference it makes. All of us, all people are born with legs. We're inherently mobile. We have to have access to opportunities. Traveling and moving around is very much part of the human condition, and it's difficult to think of a lot of other sectors that I think really affects people's livelihoods at such a scale on a day-to-day level. So I very much like to bring this sort of motivation into my work, and helping also to align, I guess, different cultures and different disciplines and sectors as well in the work that I do in transport.
Also interesting about, 6 primary schools?
Yes, a few, yeah. Hard to keep your friends from that age as well.
Yes, I was just going to say, I was like, that's a lot of moving around. But I mean, I guess you could say it's a positive thing if it's influenced you to be able to look at transport from such a unique perspective.
Absolutely. Wouldn't be where I am today without that sort of background, and I guess really a burning desire, I think, to link to that to make a difference as well.
Of course, yeah. So on our phone call before we started recording this episode, you brought up the idea of fragmentation and its relationship to public transport. So what would be considered fragmented public transport operations or management, and how does that occur?
Look, there's kind of system fragmentation issues across transport as a whole, not only in public transport, but I guess when you have an abundance of different modes, different operators, different contracts and responsibilities, there's bound to be a lot of lack of coordination, and that exhibits itself in kind of pain points for the end user, for customers. We obviously see this, I guess, a typical example could be bus to train connections. There's a mismatch in terms of service frequency, service span, things like that. So, at a multimodal level, there is that issue. There's also, I guess, a lot of places where system fragmentation is designed in part because of the way government has actually gone about procuring public transport. So, as an example, in Sydney, we have 15 different service contracts for buses, and they're planned and scheduled very much independently a lot of time. Although there's been a lot of improvement over the years, and oftentimes you see contract boundaries. There's a lot of integration issues there. So that's just within mode kind of example. And I guess nowadays we're also seeing, certainly in the past decade or more, this proliferation of new emerging shared mobility providers, ride sharing, car sharing, e-scooters, on-demand transport as well. So there's a very much a lot of these modes that we can also regard as public as well. I mean, it comes to the question, do we think of public transport as just mass transit, or is it anything that is non-private transport? So you don't have to own an expensive vehicle to access. But the way a lot of these emerging new services, how they're provided sort of outside the contracted remit of government, very much just in the marketplace. There's a lot of improvements that could be had in terms of its integration with fixed route, contracted public transport, but also within itself as well. And probably finally, I'd also add there's an infrastructure component as well to this fragmentation, how we design interchanges, how well we actually link public transport and other sort of transportation sort of investments with land use, as an example.
Yeah, totally. I think from what it sounds like, it's almost like these additions of new forms of mobility or even micro mobility are challenging or expanding our traditional notions of what is public transport or just transport.
Definitely, and I guess one of the key issues there that you raise is in terms of, because there's such a blurring of lines, I guess, in terms of what we regard as previously quite siloed independent transportation modes. A lot of the procurement and regulatory practices has not actually kept up the pace of it to adapt. So, for instance, we have fixed route public transport. We have buses in large, full-size, rigid vehicles that through time we have decided is deserving of subsidy. Remember, the fare box recovery is only about 20% on public transport, whereas these new modalities that have come online, we've decided somehow that they're not worthy of subsidy, as an example, even though they might be operating in cases, for instance, the fringes of our cities, where it might actually make more sense to subsidize, for instance, an Uber pool style on-demand service rather than fixed route public transport. But the current way we actually specify contracts, for instance, does not allow for that to happen.
Yeah. Okay. Very interesting. So you mentioned one of the pain points, which is I also kind of have to suffer with a bit, which is bus to train connections. What other implications are there for customers in terms of this fragmentation and this blurring of the lines instead of the siloing of different modes of transport?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that an integrated transport system is much more than the sum of its parts. We can actually do so much without actually investing additional money if we do things in a more clever kind of manner. So over where I live, on Sydney's North Shore, I'm right next to the A3, one of the major orbital arterials in Sydney, and it's right on a contract boundary between two different operators, and the two different bus routes that also run to both stations on both ends, so Gordon and Macquarie Park. But the way they are actually scheduled, both routes run 2 times per hour, but they're scheduled to actually depart within 5 minutes of each other, which means effectively to a customer, I have to go and look at the schedule. Those two, if you depart at, so your headway is 5 minutes and then 25 minutes and then 5 minutes and then 25 minutes. So effectively, that's only 2 buses an hour to the customer. The buses are going to the same location. Whereas if we're actually able to schedule that in a way so that it's actually evenly divided out, so 15-minute even headway throughout the day, then that actually becomes a turn up and go service. And then myself and other customers, you wouldn't be looking at a timetable to go there. That's a high frequency corridor. And that's, there's not additional service investment there. It's just a more clever way of actually making the service more useful to customers. So this was actually one of the initiatives when I worked in Canberra for the bus operator over there, about half a decade ago now, actually. But that was one of the things I was doing along major corridors and actually between major destinations as well, how we can actually improve effective frequency for zero additional cost, not only through better scheduling, but also clever branding strategies as well. So when you do something like that, you can brand two routes together as one common corridor, one high frequency trunk, and then people, and then it becomes instantly much more useful for all people.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is there a way with this idea of a turn up and go and adjusting the frequency of services that can be improved upon by the advent of new technology, or how can we kind of apply technology to this pain point?
Well, technology certainly helps, I think, in terms of actually operators being able to collaborate better in scheduling as well. And I guess as a broader question, beyond just talking about that particular context, technology has very much been part of this lexicon in transportation, and closely associated with integration over the past, at least past couple of years or more. But one of the big ideas that have been that has been gaining a lot of traction is the idea of mobility as a service, or MAS for short. And so it's really this idea about how we can have a one-stop technology platform that helps with sort of digitally integrating trip creation, purchase, and delivery. So doing that can help us a lot in terms of how we can access not only public transport, but in conjunction, combined with some of the shared mobility services I talked about in an integrated fashion, whether it is around ticketing or booking and information as well. I guess technology is only one piece of the puzzle. There's a huge amount that we can do, as I mentioned, around governance and the regulatory sort of dimension. How we can actually reform the procurement of transport so that it becomes more mode agnostic rather than picking winners in some ways in terms of which modes are actually deserving of subsidy. So I'm talking about ways we can actually have mode agnostic multimodal contracts, for instance, that really endogenize integration so that the custodian of mobility in a particular locale, they're actually incentivized within itself to make sure that all services that come under its remit actually integrate well. And closely aligned with all of this is also how we set regulation, I think, for a lot of these shared mobility providers, including especially ride hailing, I would say. And Singapore has done this very well in terms of this requirement for such providers, these transportation network companies, to do multi-homing. Or to enable that through data sharing, for instance. So that means that you or I, as a customer, when we're booking a ride-hailing trip, we can actually have a one-stop shop to book different providers together. Whereas whether it be Uber or Didi or Ola or Taxify or others, so that you don't have independent apps as well. And you actually get better economies of scale and improve the service level for customers. And the same thing on the driver side, on the supply side interface as well, in terms of drivers being able to drive for different apps.
Of course. On your point about kind of agnostic systems, and there's also this phrase thrown around a lot about a 15-minute city and what transport modes are available versus what people will actually use. And it kind of brings up this idea of formal versus informal mobility. So what are informal forms of mobility, and what role do they play in people's mobility choices or their decisions?
Right, you touched on a few things there, Emily. Firstly, with 15-minute cities or 20-minute cities, or sometimes you hear about 30-minute cities, it links back to this age-old idea of actually Machete's constant, which is the idea that us as humanity, we have a travel time budget that we adhere to. So it's about 60 minutes a day, 30 minutes per single trip leg, I suppose. And as actually technology has improved through tramways, railways, automobiles, our cities have been able to grow, and we've able to keep our travel time more or less constant. So this whole conception these days about this, and we hear about city of cities, or the three cities kind of plan here for Sydney, the harbour city, river city, the Western Parkland city as well, is how we can actually do more activities closer to where we live and actually access jobs, for instance, and recreation, a lot of these other things, without reliance on that private car, but through active modes and public transport as well. In terms of informal mobility, I guess the phrase informal is often thrown about in a developing country context. So, in Africa or South Asia or South America, where there's a lot of these people rely on public transport services that are provided by the market in very much an economically deregulated environment, quite informal, if you will, in terms of planning or otherwise. So, these include kind of the minibus taxis in South Africa, the dala-dalas in Tanzania, and the like motorized three-wheelers, tuk-tuks in many ways as well. And I guess in where the developed world has actually moved towards is in some ways emulating a little bit, facilitated by technology, some of these modes, informal modes that we've seen in developing countries, which I guess are more demand responsive and using smaller vehicles and less, I guess, fixed route and fixed schedule. So as I was saying, in developed countries, we've seen kind of traditionally there's been a real void, I guess, between public transport, your fixed route, fixed schedule, high capacity vehicles, and private transport, whether it be, I guess, your private car, or it is something like, I guess, taxi, if you will, also point to point. So there's a huge kind of chasm right in the middle that's been filled up these days by ride sharing, car sharing, bike sharing, e-scooters, and the like. Blurring of these traditional modal boundaries, transit fusion, almost blending in the best characteristics of every single mode, because now you're getting more speed, you're getting more agile kind of services there in the middle as well to meet people's travel needs in ways that are quicker and easier, I suppose, than traditional fixed route propositions. So I think we're moving to very much a future, I think, where a lot of these modes in the middle that I spoke of, these shared mobility modes, will actually play a much bigger role in terms of our cities, especially in a lot of places that are like smaller distance journeys, for instance, first and last mile contexts, places where if you're just traveling about in the community, remember about 60% of all trips are 5 miles or less in distance. So a lot of these trips you don't need to lug around a 1-ton private car to do. You can do on a lot of these other modes that battery technologies, for instance, are making possible. So I think there's a huge room to play for these informal or simply new modes of technology that are coming online.
Yeah, sure. That's an interesting way of framing it, actually, because I do kind of agree that the idea of informal doesn't really it doesn't kind of almost match in a Western concept because there it's not informal in the traditional sense. So I liked the idea of that fixed versus private and then that giant chasm in the middle,
Mm.
which lends itself to the next question I had, which was what could we do to improve maybe the design of our transport networks and our public infrastructure to better address those mobility needs of customers?
Well, we've mentioned a couple of, I guess, areas we could integrate better on a service planning kind of front, and also governance and procurement around mode agnostic multimodal contracts, for instance. But I guess one thing, and I've been very this has been close to my heart quite lately. But I think also a diversity of governance amongst the decision makers as well within the transport sector. One of the, I guess, age old kind of adages, especially in public transport, is that services are operated for the convenience of the operator rather than the customer. And a lot of the times we actually see that ways where we can make services better for the customer. So, for instance, using a dedicated fleet to particular routes, for example, and we're seeing some of that now with the B line, for instance, things like clock face scheduling to make the schedules easier to remember or just more even. A lot of these initiatives, they're less operationally efficient, but they mean a lot for actually the customer. So there's often a trade off. There's a value judgment there. So I think one of the issues is another major issue is that a lot of the operators are quite conservative in many ways. A lot of the decision makers, the senior executives, the people in charge are not exactly representative of the customers. We know that people who use public transport, they're more likely to be lower socioeconomic status. They're more likely to be women. There's age and ethnicity kind of gaps as well. So if we could make a lot of the decision makers, and we talked about this another time, Emily, but a lot of there's kind of a systematic issue, and kind of subconsciously we've designed cities, whether it is assuming what direction people make a transfer to, assuming everyone sort of makes a journey to work into the CBD because that's exactly who the people in charge they do themselves. So there's a lot of that can be changed, I think, in terms of injecting people into decision making roles, playing just making governance more diverse. And there's quite easy things you can do from the outset. For instance, getting the leadership in your transport agency or in your transport operators, get them to use their own services, get them to audit a route every week, for instance, rather than certainly in not saying where. A lot of these people might be chauffeured around from place to place, or they might be, I don't know, snobby academics or otherwise. So there's a lot of practical things that can be done to inject in amongst our decision makers a broader breadth of understanding that would, I think, in the end, help to make our transport networks and systems more inclusive too.
Sure. Yeah. We had a conversation about this kind of briefly before the podcast, where I told you I was reading a book called Invisible Women by Caroline Perez, which it is tends to be on that gendered side of the implications of not enough diversity at maybe the top levels, but it is a very interesting kind of probably another whole episode really on the impacts of kind of ungendered data or data that is not separated by the other factors that may affect it, like socioeconomic status or who is actually gathering the data and how they're gathering it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on the idea of decision makers and the role of government, what do you think could be done on a regulatory and procurement level by governments or transport bodies to improve network resilience, particularly when faced with unexpected shocks, which I think we're all very familiar with after the last 12 to 18 months?
Emily, we've been facing one of the biggest challenges through COVID in public transport and also more broadly the transport system. And we've seen in many ways that we have a very lean transport system through the years. There's been a lot of focus on cost efficiency as an example, and where we've designed in these gross cost management contracts where businesses, your private sector operators, there, it's about doing, mathematics or reducing their margins to win contracts rather than imbuing a lot of innovation or a lot of, I guess, flexibility, or really there's not enough done to actually incentivize operators to go above and beyond. So we saw, I guess, through lockdown as an example, we've seen sort of when there's no more traffic on the roads, when there's hardly any passengers. Here we are running sort of a pre-pandemic peak hour network service schedules, simply because it's very hard to actually be more agile and change very very quickly, I suppose. So there you have sort of buses running down the street at 20 k's an hour, or trains with far too much dwell times at stations, which is inefficient, ineffective, and also a lot of wasted resources that could be devoted to better places. So we also saw in the lockdown places in Sydney's western suburbs, which are more likely to be more, I guess, lower socioeconomic status, more people that do blue collar work, essential workers who have to travel. We saw patronage about 30% of usual, whereas in the eastern suburbs, it was about 5% of usual. And that's a huge opportunity there to actually redeploy service at very quick notice to help to support things like social distancing and giving people better options as well. We've also seen just Australia compared to the rest of the world around the take up of technologies, things like quite recently, cleaning and disinfection technologies. There really hasn't been a lot of innovation here in Australia in public transport, in terms of UV or fogging or other sort of epidemic sort of garments and the like. Whereas in the private sector, where companies actually compete. So in retail, as an example, McDonald's, Apple, they're typical, really, really good examples there. They actually compete to see how well their processes can be, and the technologies that they deploy. So we see very little of that in the public transport space. And I guess more generally as well, when we talk about things like telematics, artificial intelligence, those vision-based analytical systems we have now for safety, for customer tracking, a lot of the rest of the world are far more ahead of us. So I think Australian companies do have that. The companies who are less insular and look beyond our borders to the rest of the world, to where other places are coming to actually look at technologies, including the excellent sort of capabilities of what you guys do at Compass IoT in terms of getting data there. A lot of that is really useful for optimizing running times, for example, which is one of the greatest areas you can save money in a bus business, as one example. These are the companies that are going to lead the pack and also demonstrate the greatest agility and resilience as well, both for now and whenever there is any external shock that arises.
Yeah, definitely. Super interesting. I'm a little bit biased because, of course, I work in innovation and technology, and that overlaps with the transport space.
And you should be. You should be. It's great work that you guys do.
So, on the final question that I have to you, it's a bit more of I guess, a fun question, particularly on we've talked, or you've mentioned so many things about technology, or in the difference between incentives in public versus private business spheres. If you had the opportunity, what would be the smallest change that you could make to our transport systems that would have the biggest impact or the biggest return on investment?
Right. Well, I'm not going to offer up something on technology, and I'm going to offer something I think is both a small thing because it's free, I guess, but
Mhm.
also one of the hardest things to do as well. So I'm talking about a more evidence-based, a more rational and less emotional approach to policy making. It's free. It's free to do, and we sort of know the best practices that are out there. We sort of know what needs to be done, but time and time again, the political order of the day and I guess a lot of other sort of necessities actually make it so that it's very hard to do. So I'm talking about things like just reallocating road space towards the most spatially efficient modes. There's this obsession, I guess, with not wanting to hurt private car drivers, which I guess they are the majority of the electorate. But there's so much that can be done whenever we're talking about a bus lane, for instance, not actually going out and doing property acquisition to build that bus lane, but actually reallocating existing road space for things like that. There seems to be a great obsession with new infrastructure, and we know that in new infrastructure, whether it is rail or otherwise, most of the cost is in constructing or property acquisition to get that right of way, and as a result, you're very lucky to get a return, a benefit cost ratio of 1 or 2. Whereas when we do things that are reallocating existing road space, as I mentioned, bus lanes or queue jumps, pinch points, cycleways as well, you can easily reach a BCR of 20 or 30. But the big problem has been actually doing things that hurt, I guess, existing car drivers. The car is still king. There's still a lot of pride associated with it. So I guess a lot of my work and my work over the years has been actually helping to bring a more evidence-based, less emotional, more rational kind of discourse to public decision making and all the stakeholders involved together with us.
Amazing. I mean, from the time that I've known you, I think that suits you very well. So, Yale, thank you so much for chatting to me today. It has been really, really interesting talking about fragmentation and public transport and mobility.
I enjoyed it too. Thank you very much, Emily, for the opportunity.
If you'd like to know a little bit more about Yale or what Yale does, you can get in touch via www.drtransportation.org, which I'll leave the website for that in the podcast description box. And if you'd like to know more about Byte Size or Compass IoT that runs the podcast, you can get in touch with us via our website, which is www.compassiot.com.au. Until next time.